Hello, and welcome to the Hero Report. My name is Ari Cohen. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska. With me, as always, is Matt Langdon from the Hero Construction Company. And this week, we're joined by Mike Trivella, who is a sophomore at the University of Notre Dame. We've asked Mike to be on the show this week to talk with us about sports heroes. It's not just because Charles Barkley wasn't available to talk with us this week, although that is true. It's also the case that Mike wrote a very interesting piece on heroism in sports for the Nextgen Journal that Matt and I both came across, and we'll post a link to that piece at the end of the podcast. So Mike, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I'm real excited to be here.
Sure. Mike, maybe if you could just, since people won't have read this when they're listening, maybe you can tell us just briefly what led you to write the piece and what your basic argument in the piece is.
Well, so basically what I thought of when I was writing this article was that we were studying Aristotle and his Nicomachean Ethics in the history of ancient and medieval philosophy, and I'm a philosophy minor. So, and he gets to the point of talking about the four cardinal virtues. I mean, this is kind of him and Plato, but I'll just attribute it to him more because it kind of flows better with my argument. But the four cardinal virtues of Greek society were practical wisdom, fortitude, temperance, and then the overarching virtue was morality, which kind of keeps the all three of those virtues in check. And obviously, a lot of people have sports heroes just because of the epic things that people do in sports, like Mario Manningham two-stepping on the sideline in this year's Super Bowl, or Patrick Kane scoring the final shot, like at a couple Stanley Cups 2 years ago. And that's like what usually people think of as heroes, like athletic heroes. But my whole question was, can you have athletic heroes that not only have success on the field, but kind of also in the mental capacity? And I thought that, especially in a time where our society is kind of bereft of heroes, especially, I mean, in politics, you really don't find anybody standing out and trying to improve the situation. You have a lot of partisanship, and that's definitely not what the American public's looking for. So it's hard to find certain heroes in politics. And then you look to, well, what other sectors of society do we have that you can have heroes in? It's like, well, what about business? And it's just like, within business, there are people that look up to certain CEOs and presidents and board of directors, but especially with the downturn in the economy and all the bonus issues that have been going on at AIG a couple of years back, people technically have a negative view of business. So I was trying to see, well, why not have sports heroes are not just athletic heroes, but also moral heroes? So you're looking for athletes that not only excel on the field, but also they do show those four core attributes that I was talking about. So basically, I go through the article and try and bring up certain people and see if they kind of fit the mold. And I also tried to show how certain athletes at times failed to do that. So for example, Tiger Woods, obviously, with his whole, I mean, maybe now he's on the track back to his prior glory, but he had a pretty big issue with temperance back in the day when he committed all those infidelities. So I think mainly, I guess it was kind of like a plea. I think everybody wants a hero, everybody needs a hero, especially in a time like this. And I was just saying kind of just wondering, do we have certain people like that?
And so did you come up with some examples then? Obviously you were looking for them. Who were some examples that you found that fit that mold?
Well, I'd say if I could, I don't remember it all quite well, but I do have a couple in mind. I'd say the first one I can think of, just being a New Jersey kid, would be Derek Jeter. Just because, I mean, he's been the captain of the Yankees ever since. I mean, he's been on that team for the past 16 years, and not once has he ever come up in the media in a bad light. He's always very giving of himself. He has great on-field success, but he also poses these virtues that make people in the city proud to have him as their leader. And then I guess for another golfing example, you could look at Phil Mickelson, who obviously back in the day wasn't as successful as Tiger, but recently has been winning a lot more majors and a lot more tournaments. And me and my dad always have this argument because I've always been rooting for Tiger just because I always kind of astounded by the way he played. But my dad always liked Phil better just because he was more of a gentleman. He was more of the people's champion. Because I remember there was one example. The PGA Championship came to a couple of towns away from us about 5 years ago. My mom somehow got a ticket to go, so she was on the fairway, and Phil comes up and he's giving everybody high fives, signing autographs, giving hugs, and everyone just genuinely loves this guy. And then you have Tiger, who commands complete silence on the course, and if you say one thing, he'll look back and he's like, "Really?" Like, it's just a big difference between how they two act, and it makes a lot of difference for the people that are watching them.
I think that's a great point, that so much of it comes out in personality, and that Tiger Woods he never came across as a people's person, right?
Yeah.
And that makes it difficult to imagine yourself like that. I mean, it's difficult to put yourself in that position where you're kind of in this lofty position where almost on top of Olympus, that you're one of the gods and you're kind of untouchable. I really like that comparison there, and I think there's lots of different examples across sports that you can see that happening as well.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'm going to step in and try to make this harder on us. Because, yes, I think the first thing to say is that you're right? If we could have the superstar athlete who is also a really great person, well, that's tremendous, right? That's exactly what we want. But what if we can't, right? In other words, what if there is something, and people talked about this a lot surrounding the Tiger Woods mess, but what if there is something about that intensely competitive drive that leads athletes to excel, but also perhaps to be the kind of people that are always really driven and then maybe are not so the most caring or compassionate or whatever, right? I mean, if we think about the athletes who really are the best, isn't it enough that they're just great at what they do? And shouldn't we maybe say, well, we can appreciate that for what it is, and we'll look elsewhere for our examples of good people?
That's a good question. It's pretty hard to answer as well, I'd say. But I think just one of the big problems with that is that everyone has like a personal hero that I mean, like I said in my article, my mom and my dad are two of my big heroes, obviously just because of the way they raised me and my brothers, and how I'll always look up to them and appreciate them for what they've done. But I think it's important enough, like, not all people are in the public spotlight. And I think it's not technically fair, and if any of us were celebrities, we might get a little bit tired of it eventually, but I think when you're in the public spotlight, you're kind of expected to do more, to kind of go above and beyond. And like I said, it's not fair, but it kind of gives you a chance to be almost a more well-rounded person. Like with those with the four virtues I was saying before, the whole point's not to just be a moral person and that's it. Like it's obviously a lofty ideal to try and achieve, but if you can achieve it, the whole point is that you become this well-rounded Renaissance man in a way. And I think that while at times it is tough and that we shouldn't always expect everyone to do it, I think there are people that are capable of doing it, and that's why we should continue to look for them.
Yeah,
I think that was a cop-out, Ari. I think just being great at something doesn't mean, it doesn't exclude you from also being a good person. I mean, there's and we should have that expectation. We should have the expectation that that all people are good people, and we shouldn't let people slide because they're driven or because they're exceptional at something. We need to, you know, I think Mike's approach here is is that because these people are in the public sphere, they are our best or our most prevalent options for heroes, right? They are the people that we see a lot of, along with the celebrities or politicians or whoever else it might be. This is the pool we're looking for. We want to find people that exhibit good character, and I don't think being great at something excludes you from that.
I'm going to push back again because I said Charles Barkley couldn't be here, right? So I'm going to take Barkley's position. I mean, isn't this ultimately his I am not a role model position? You know, the truth is, it's on us, isn't it? I mean, we made them celebrities. It's our desire to watch them play a game that leads them to be in the public eye and to be multi-millionaires and so on. They're just playing a game.
But with great power comes great responsibility, Ari.
And they're not really rejecting that either. I bet it's not like Charles Barkley is just like, oh, I want to be a good basketball player, but I don't want to get money. Or I want to be a good basketball player, but I don't want to be a celebrity.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I also, I mean, I want to suggest, like, he does, right? These people want to be the best at what they do, and they want to be recognized for being the best at what they do. But I think, so I have a little clip from your piece. I think you said, the ever-pervasive media of the 21st century does little justice to those sports figures and other celebrities who wish to keep their private lives private, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was such an interesting quote because, you know, it'd be great if they were doing their own private things and that those things were good things rather than bad things, right? I would expect, you know, LeBron and whomever else to be good parents, you know, to their children and so on. But, you know, I think what we like to do more than anything is we like to pick apart when they fail. We like to, you know, because they're famous, because they're wealthy, because they're really good at something, we relish those times when they fall short. And I don't know that we have, you know, I don't know that looking at sports figures and saying these are going to be our moral heroes, I think we're sort of setting them up in some way to disappoint, right? Some of them undoubtedly are very good people. Maybe 95% of them are very good people. But if they really just want to play their game and then have their private life separate, who are we to complain?
I think you're playing into Charles Barkley's court here. He's a guy who loves the spotlight, so he can't complain. He's chosen to take the spotlight, and people like LeBron, Kobe, they've chosen the spotlight. I can think of Marvin Harrison from the Colts, who was one of the best top 3, maybe number 1 receiver in the league. He didn't choose that life. He didn't choose to be the guy who was mouthing off all the time. So these guys have had the choice to make themselves into the celebrity, and probably they had agents who contributed to that, right? But I mean, that's a complete cop-out from Charles Barkley. The fact is, you have millions of eyes on you. You have a choice on how you're going to behave. To say that you don't have a responsibility to be a role model, the horse is already out the gate. You're in that position. Now it's your turn to see what you're going to do. I completely reject the idea that they have to be these massive public figures. Barry Sanders is another one. Ari, I'm sure you saw a bit of.
My favorite.
And there's a guy that doesn't, you know, he didn't have his private life out in public.
And going off what Matt said, another example of that's LeBron James. This kid comes into the league at 18, and he's this big hotshot, and everyone in the media loves him. And then he switches to Miami, and everyone kind of thinks he's the next Judas. And he gets all the way to the NBA Finals and loses. And then 2 days later blames the media for giving him a bad persona. It's not like you can't just use this machine like for your own special devices. And then when times are bad, turn on and say, well, you made me look bad. I think a lot of it is on the person themselves. You can't just blame the media because everyone has a job to do in society. They're just doing theirs, and they're giving what the average Joes want, is to see how every person, like every celebrity, is doing. But yeah, I have to agree with Matt. I think sometimes you can't just say I want to be the best and I want to be well known, but at the same time take no responsibility.
Well, Mike, I think LeBron's a great example too. I used to use him in my presentations to kids because of the exemplary way he entered the league, and he came in at the same time as Carmelo, who, you know, came into this spotlight as well and completely fell apart. I mean, he was hanging out with his games, getting into fights in bars. He went straight to Denver and said, "This is my team. You need to start playing around me." Whereas LeBron went to a small market team, stayed there, did not make the focus on himself, and it wasn't until, you know, those few years ago when I remember watching the playoffs when Cleveland lost, and LeBron had his post-match interview was all about himself, and it was there where I was like, okay, this guy has changed. He's gone from someone who I thought would be a great role model for kids to someone who has fallen into the trap of me.
Okay, then I'm going to jump in. Here we go. I'm not done yet. Although I think I'm fighting a losing battle here. Because if people who are listening to the podcast and not watching it, I'm smiling the whole time. You can't tell because you can't see me, but I am. So here's my last gasp, maybe. How much do we demand of them then, right? So LeBron comes into the league. He's 18 years old. He signs a $100 million shoe contract with Nike, right? And then there's the game checks that he gets from Cleveland and whatever other endorsement deals he inks and so on, right? And he buys a house, doesn't he? Do you remember these stories about LeBron's house? If I remember correctly, my house could fit in the master bedroom's closet in LeBron's house. I might be wrong. I might have my numbers wrong, but something about that rings kind of familiar to me. It was like a shopping mall-sized house. How good does LeBron need to be? Isn't it, I mean, if we're talking about like caring about others and helping other people, isn't there a point where someone who, being a good example for children, could we say that he owed a little bit more? He has this great deal fall into his lap as an 18-year-old kid. He could probably do something for others, buy a slightly smaller house.
How is buying a smaller house doing something for someone else?
Well, because he could take the money that he didn't spend on the giant house and give it to a charity.
Jump in, Mike.
I watch Entourage, so maybe the source isn't totally accurate, but I do remember him being involved in some charities. But I do have to give Ari some credit on this one because I've always been really anti people just kind of showing off their wealth like that. And honestly, how much like living space does one guy need? I mean, there's like being comfortable, and then there's just kind of being lavish and ostentatious. And I think he kind of failed to.
Temperance.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. Now we're going back to the article.
I think you've got a point generally on character there, but it doesn't. I don't think that affects role model. I think decisions. I think his behavior in public. I think his attitude towards winning and losing to his teammates. That's the kind of thing that we're looking for. I think team sports in general, you would think have a good potential to build heroes in, right? Because you're supposed to be thinking about others. And so I think there's potential there, but I think the reality of sports, especially when you start getting paid for it, is to stand out and to be focused on yourself and your solo success.
Especially the NBA. Especially the NBA, Matt.
Right.
I think that you gave examples like Marvin Harrison and Barry Sanders. They're kind of old school football players. I think that the contemporary NFL is going to get more challenging. But the NBA is probably the worst place to look for heroes. That's the argument I'm going to stand by. And I think that that has a lot to do with the NCAA, with the one-and-done rule in college. We're asked. So, LeBron again is a great example. He comes in before the one-and-done rule, so he's out of high school, and he's 18 years old, and we want him to be people's hero, not simply because he can play basketball well, which is something he knows how to do. He practices hard. He has innate ability. That's no problem. But we also want this 18-year-old to be a moral hero. Right? Someone who has the right attitude about winning and losing, someone who is a great teammate, someone who gives to charities, someone who is an intellect and who gives a good interview and is temperate and all. Really? How can we expect that?
Well, I don't think we're expecting it, but we're looking for it. I think that's what Mike's article was about. Is here's a pool of potential hero or potential role models, potential inspirations for us. That's what we want. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're hoping for. I don't necessarily think we expect it, but we hope for it.
Yeah.
And just as a counter example to LeBron, I guess, what about Tim Tebow? This guy was preaching to prisons before he even made it to the league, and now you see all these articles about things he's done in Denver. He's at a children's hospital every week. He invites all these disabled people onto the sideline for every game, and everyone that's ever talked to him says he's probably the nicest person they've ever met, and they wish they could always be around him. It's just these people do exist. It's just they have to make themselves known to us, and that's obviously the hardest part.
Mm-hmm. And I do think the reason that Tebow has captured people's imagination the way that he has is because he's a real rarity, right? There's not a lot of Tim Tebows or people who are even remotely similar. That could take us off in a whole different direction, obviously, behind the question of what motivates Tim Tebow and how those things are related. But I have one more thing on the general question, and then we can see where else we want to go on this. And that is, Matt, you said something about LeBron's attitude toward winning and losing. Right, and I think this is part of sort of a more general point about how you can model to young people and really to anybody, when you win, what you're supposed to say to be a gracious winner, and when you lose, how to not hang your head or blame someone else or whatever, right? But I wonder, again, if we're talking about superstar athletes, how many of them will ever display the kind of what we would regard as a healthy or appropriate or whatever role model worthy attitude toward winning and losing?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive, and I think the reason that we don't see that kind of gracious behavior is because it's not necessarily taught as that athlete has gone up through the ranks, right? That it's not a focus. And so it is rare that we get a Barry Sanders or a Rafael Nadal or someone who is this exceptional athlete. But you can look at, I don't know a whole lot about Barry Sanders' background, but Nadal has got a close family relationship, and I think that's indicative of how he has turned out. That it's when if you look at Andre Agassi or Tiger Woods has been driven to do this by people around him as well, at the exclusion of developing character and developing self-control or a personable personality. That stuff is not concentrated on right from the start, and I think that's where the problem lies. And go to a kid's sports event and just be amazed by the parents. It's pretty clear where it all comes from, and so obviously it's rare to get through all of that and have some character.
Sure.
I think Matt brings up a good point, though. I was just thinking about it as he was talking, but I wonder if there's only a certain, like, a select age gap when you could actually develop this sort of humble, or even if it's something that you can develop at all. Maybe it's just something kind of inherent in you when you're born. But like, if you can only grow, or if you can only develop such a humble attitude within a certain time frame, what does that mean for anybody that's kind of, any athlete that's kind of fallen on a bad reputation and kind of wishes to change it? Are their hopes kind of dashed by that, or is there any chance that they'll ever be able to become more well-liked in the eyes of the people?
I think Carmelo is a good example there. And I think ultimately it comes from practice and the people you surround yourself with. So, right, so there's another good example of a non-hero in sports. But yeah, I think, Carmelo changed his attitude, and I think that's that shows that it is possible, especially at the high level. Once you've reached that level, absolutely you can change.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Barry Sanders, Matt, and one of my favorite things about they used to interview Barry Sanders' dad, on the sidelines while Barry was doing some amazing thing on the field. That he was on terrible team after terrible team, but he just made. Every run, whether it was 2 yards or 40, was like a highlight. I mean, it was unbelievable. They always used to ask, Barry Sanders' dad, who's the best running back, and his dad always said, Jim Brown. And I think there is something to be said about growing up with that, You know that your son is an incredible talent, but in some sense you're unwilling to spoil him, right? And to feed him, the idea that he's the best running back. Yeah, I think there's certainly something to that. Now, of course, you and I are committed to this idea that to answer Mike's question, that there isn't a cutoff point, right? That you can amend some of these bad decisions, right? And it's funny how many times we keep saying decision, and that we're talking about LeBron, because of course the decision was the worst possible decision in terms of the way that it was executed. If you're looking for someone, who would appear to be sort of a stand-up guy and who you could say, I hope my kids grow up to be like this. I want them to watch him on television and so on, because here he is on television in front of a gymnasium full of kids in the most sort of self-aggrandizing hour-long interview and clip show. It was really awful. So yes, I mean, it seems to me, but again, to go back to the question of what leads someone to this position, right? I mean, I think it's a mistake to say that at the beginning LeBron was in really great shape and was poised to become the moral hero of the next generation, because this is the same kid in high school whose mom took out a loan on his future earning potential to buy him, if I remember correctly, this was the King James Humvee, right? That had the embroidered seat covers that said King James, and that had like Xbox consoles built into the back seat and all this kind of stuff. I mean, if you don't see where that's headed, if you don't have an inclination of where this is going to go, I mean, then you're probably not paying attention, right? So, maybe my true feelings are coming out now that we're in sort of the second half of this podcast, but, I think it's very clear that if we do want to put athletes, celebrities, whomever, up on a pedestal, and say this is not simply a pedestal for someone who excels in shooting a ball through a hoop or hitting a ball with a stick, but this is also a pedestal for someone who knows the difference between right and wrong, who knows about hard work and making the right choices and so on. Well, then we have to, in some sense, provide people with the tools, right?
I think I think professional sports makes it very difficult for people to get. It's a huge challenge for them to resist. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. It's this set of trials along their path that can easily distract them from where they're going. And I think politicians have the same thing. They've got temptation after temptation after temptation to stray, and same with celebrities. I mean, it's something that most of us will never understand. When I win the Mega Millions tomorrow, I think I'll be able to come back and explain a little more. But we can't conceive of having so much money, and the temptations that come with fame. So again, I think when we find these people that we can hold up, we really need to appreciate them and tell them that they're appreciated, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I wonder if we do, and maybe this speaks again to that quote that I read from your piece, Mike. I wonder if we do a good job at all about appreciating the people who really do the sort of thing that your article is looking for, or whether we really are trying to, or someone is trying to rip them down, right? I really wonder about that. What do you think?
I mean, I feel like this is just my opinion, but I've never, especially with like sports people that you like to watch, I think it's always kind of sad when, I think a lot of this also has to do with ESPN, because back in the day when all there was just kind of cable news covering sports during like an hourly long news segment, there wasn't as much of this huge focus on sports. And I'm not trying to tear apart ESPN, because honestly the first thing I do when I go on the internet is type in ESPN.com. But I think it brings about these big changes where now there's a much bigger focus on all these athletes. And I'm sorry, I think I just missed I'm blanking on the second part of your question here.
That's okay. Your ESPN thing actually made me think of something really interesting. You know, I was listening to Bill Simmons' podcast yesterday, and he was talking to a couple of the Grantland.com staff writers about the Trayvon Martin coverage in the media, and also whether or not it was a sports story. And I think that this is an interesting thing because there's another LeBron component here, right? Because the Miami Heat took that picture that I guess LeBron organized, where they're all wearing hoodies, and this was something that was clearly done, I think, not in a sort of self-aggrandizing way, but that, again, you know, if we're trying to figure out who these people are, I think this helps us to see this sort of oversaturation of the media or whatever, the excessive look that we get into these people's lives. Maybe it should help us recognize that all of these people are just as complex as we are, right? You know, the same LeBron who made a mistake with the decision and who took a really, really long time to come around to recognizing that the way he handled it was a mistake, is also the LeBron who's a father of children, and who wants to make I think a pretty serious statement about what it means to be a young black man with young black children in this country, right? And so, you know, obviously none of these people are going to be perfect, and if we're looking at them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you know, the chances that we find something that doesn't appeal to us, you know, it gets higher and higher every day, the likelihood of that.
Yeah, I think we're looking for patterns rather than perfection, right? I mean, we're looking for repeated behavior that allows us to make these sorts of judgments on people we've never met before. And right, I mean, that's exactly it. We're not looking for perfection. There's going to be mistakes, absolutely. Some of what we're looking for is going to be how they apologize for those mistakes. I mean, give a plug to your new website there, Ari. But I mean, bad apologies show a lot about who the person is. So watching how they deal with their mistakes is pretty enlightening as well.
And I think kind of in the end what it boils down to is just, maybe this is just kind of a little bit of an overarching statement about fame, but I feel just any celebrity, not even a sports person, but any politician, any celebrity in general, they just kind of, you get this general sense of self-entitlement that people know me more and I can get away with a lot more things. And I think it kind of goes to your head, and you think that you rule the world, and you're above just average guys like you and me sitting here talking on a podcast. But I also think, and that's why it leads to these crazy things like a decision, and it's just like, why, like, any normal person would never think to do this. One, because they could not get anybody to film it, but two, just it's like, it's completely ridiculous to think that people care this much about your life. But on the other hand, I think that, going along with what Matt said, obviously perfect role models, while they may not exist and we might be looking for patterns, they're just as interesting as the stories of people that have kind of fallen hard and they've built up their image like way late in their career, so that at the end of by the time they retire, we have this favorable view of them. I think that's just as remarkable a story as a person that's been kind of this moral light throughout.
Absolutely. I think, Ari, we should get Mike back on the show more often because he agrees with me a lot.
It's nice, isn't it?
Yeah.
I actually like Mike's idea. I think that if I'm ever in the position where I'm deciding between two jobs, I'm going to hold a gigantic press conference at the Boys and Girls Club, and I'm going to make my announcement.
Perfect. So I'm wondering, Ari, like, I know you need to leave in a little bit, but when we talk about heroism in sports, I think obviously we're talking about one type of heroism here, and the idea that these people are or potentially can be inspiring to others and should be thinking about that and acting accordingly. But I wonder if there's any room in sports for heroic acts, so that is the idea of taking a risk or a sacrifice for the good of others. There's an obvious example of a heroic sports person, but this was leaving sports in joining the military and then getting assassinated by his comrades for his trouble. That's someone who gives up a lot, obviously, as a sacrifice. But is it possible within sports to make those kinds of actions?
Sure. So, I mean, you're referencing the Pat Tillman story, obviously.
Right.
But it seems to me that you could come up with all sorts. I mean, wouldn't it in some sense have been a heroic self-sacrifice if LeBron's decision had been to stay in Cleveland?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, and look, just a couple weeks ago, maybe even less than a couple, Peyton Manning. What if he had just decided to be a good mentor to Andrew Luck?
I think that's kind of hard, though, because, I mean,
terribly hard.
For all this credit we give to heroes, I think if a lot of athletes, they're not. We see it all the time with NFL players that just refuse to retire. If you feel that you can still play, you're just going to keep playing, and you're going to try and get the best chance to play. But a self-sacrifice in sports, I was just kind of racking my brain for examples. But hockey, especially on like when it comes, I'm not a big hockey fan, but when it comes to playoffs, I love watching it just because everything's on the line. And you see these games late in the third period, it's a tie game, and there's a power play, and you just see these defensemen all backing up into their zone, literally diving to block slap shots, and they come away from these games all bloody and bruised, and they don't even feel it because in the end, it's not even about them. They get the chance to hoist like the world's oldest trophy, and I guess. And that kind of brings in the whole team hero aspect. It's not about me, and we're here not just for ourselves, but for the others and for a whole town. I think that's just remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I mean, people who know me know that I'm from Detroit originally, and I like to talk about Detroit examples. But anytime I think about the people who play for any of the Detroit sports teams, the thing that always comes to mind is the number of times that they reference how important winning would be for the people of Detroit, right? That when the Pistons won that unlikely championship in, I think it was 2004, it was clearly a lot of people sort of denigrated the team. There was no superstar. It was just a bunch of guys. It was very unlikely that they came out on top, but they did, and it was huge for the city, and they all recognized that. And I think that, I mean, that might be an example. It's not, maybe it's not so explicit, but I do think that there is a way that, sports captures the public imagination, and if you have a place like Detroit that is seemingly perennially down on its luck, having people who are actively trying to provide you with some positive outlook, and I think that there's something to that.
Yeah, there's definitely there are certainly stories of players who stick with the team. I think Jeter was a good example of someone who shows loyalty. And maybe it's not too difficult to be loyal to the Yankees, but
what about Steve Nash?
Right. And for our international listeners, I want to call Mike out on his oldest trophy in sports reference there. It's definitely older trophies in cricket and soccer and sailing. We'll give you that for North America.
Maybe no, yeah, we'll keep North America.
Yeah, don't forget those sailing trophies.
America's Cup. Well, I've enjoyed this conversation, and I was wondering where it was going to go, but I think I like that there's positivity about the potential of these people to do good things, and I think there are lots of good examples. One thing that Mike touched on earlier was charities, and I think that's an interesting piece of the puzzle for athletes as well as celebrities, because it's very easy to be contributing to a charity if you're rich, particularly if you've got someone paid to take care of all that stuff. But what's interesting to me is finding who the people are that really are contributing their time as well, because time is obviously more precious than money to mega rich people. So that's the charity thing's always very interesting. You've got it's how much they talk about it, and that can be a good or bad thing depending on how they're talking about it. What are your guys' thoughts on the charity aspect?
I would say that when it comes to charity, obviously anybody that's rich can contribute to charity, but I think especially with celebrities and in particular sports, like big-time athletes, I think they do even greater things for charity than just giving away their money, because I think who are they giving away all their money to? They're giving away to people lesser than themselves that obviously are down on their luck, and they might not have all these people to look up to. And I think there's one example, like Drew Brees, when he comes to the Saints in 2005, 2006 after Katrina hits, and he became a Superman for that city. He helped win them a Super Bowl, and at the same time he pretty much donated, I'm not sure about this, but I'm pretty sure that he donated selfless amounts of time and money to rebuilding the city back up. And I remember I was reading on his Wikipedia page, because I was actually writing an article about him a couple months ago, and I think the mayor said, the most powerful person in New Orleans isn't me, it's Drew Brees. He's done more for this town than I ever have.
Yeah, I think another interesting piece on the charity or the donating of time particularly is the way that the leagues encourage it too. And I noticed the NFL just is very upfront and very vocal about getting their players to participate in these donations of time, to get them out with kids that need to see them, especially their partnership with the United Way. They just seem to do a great job of understanding the responsibility and understanding what sort of obligation there is for these people. I don't know if the other leagues do it, but I'm really noticing.
Yeah, the NBA does. The NBA has that NBA Cares program, and it's the same. I mean, I think that there are two things to say about it, right? The first is that you're entirely right. It's important that they are doing it and that they're giving time and not simply money. But also these are massive PR campaigns that are put on by the league offices, right? They're in part they're about helping people, and in part they're about the image of the leagues, because the league is a product, and if you have positive associations of these people doing good things as opposed to brawling with fans or dogfighting, for example, then you're more likely to watch and support and go to games and buy jerseys and so on. So obviously there's a self-interested component even to those campaigns. Now, not to say that they don't do a lot of good for people. They undoubtedly do. But there's another motivation behind it. So in part there's that, but there's probably also a lot going on that we don't see and that we don't know about. And I think that might be important too, that we're not seeing it and we don't know about it.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to get in touch with Nolan Harrison, who's part of the NFL Players Association. He talks about heroism, and I know he feels an obligation to help teach some of these younger athletes how to handle their new life. So I think that would be an interesting perspective as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, before we go, because we sometimes forget to do this, we want to ask Mike about his heroes. And you already talked about your parents. I appreciate that. I'm sure that they'll appreciate it too when this comes out. But because we're talking about sports, and I have to say, Derek Jeter's already off the table. My Boston Red Sox friends who are going to listen to this, they've heard enough about New York area sports. So you got to pick somebody else. I've already ruled out all the good possibilities. But Mike, if we're not talking about your parents and we're not talking about Derek Jeter, do you got anybody else?
Well, I kind of gave it away with the last thing I said. It's Drew Brees. He comes out of this fourth season with Chargers with a torn it was something with his shoulder, but it was potentially career-threatening, and they kind of just throw him to the curb, and he comes to this city that's just as devastated as he is, and he pretty much just brings it back to life. And you hear him talking in interviews and other things he's done. He just seems like a genuinely nice person that obviously realizes the importance of football, and he's great at it, but he just seems to care so much about other things in life that, as much as I hate to see him win because they always seem to destroy the Giants every time they play, that you have to have nothing but respect for that guy. So if I had to pick a true sports hero, it would be Drew Brees.
Good choice. I'm a Saints fan. I'm not sure how to feel about the recent Saints news, and especially Drew Brees' knowledge of it, but we'll see.
Yeah, we can save that for another time. We don't want to, we don't want to end up a heroism in sports podcast by talking about bounties and full year suspensions and so on. But Mike, thanks. I think that's been really helpful, and we'll direct people back to your piece so they can read it for themselves. I'm very pleased, as a political theorist myself, to hear that this was inspired by philosophy, and in particular by reading Aristotle. Everyone should go read their Aristotle if they're interested in sports. So thanks again for coming on the podcast this week. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks a lot, Mike. And Ari, will see you next week with Phil Zimbardo, right?
Absolutely. Next week, we'll have another guest, a New York Times bestseller, Phil Zimbardo, our first New York Times bestseller on the podcast.
Among other things.
That's right. Well, thank you. Thanks to both of you, and we'll talk again soon.